writing this from a motel room in a town I'm not going to name, in a state I'm not going to specify, and I have about 4 hours before I need to move again. My laptop battery is at 62%, and I have one spare charger, and I'm not going to waste either of them on anything except getting this document finished and uploaded before something happens to me that makes finishing it impossible. My name is Cal Reeves. I've been an investigative journalist for 11 years, the last 6 of them freelance after the paper I worked for in Phoenix got bought out and gutted by a hedge fund that decided the investigative desk was a luxury a regional daily couldn't afford. I've covered cartel activity along the Arizona-Mexico border, illegal arms shipments through New Mexico, human trafficking operations in Texas and California. I've been shot at twice and threatened with lawsuits more times than I can count, and I've had sources disappear on me, and I've sat across from men who wanted me to understand very clearly that continuing to ask questions would be a mistake. None of that prepared me for what I found at Fort Carver. I want to be clear about something before I get into this. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I do not believe in most of the things that people who use that word believe in. I believe in documentation and verification and the chain of evidence, and I believe that the truth of a thing is almost always more complicated and less dramatic than the story people want to tell about it. I have spent 11 years applying those standards to some of the ugliest material this country produces, and I have always come out the other side with something I could defend in print. What I found at Fort Carver I cannot defend in print. Not because it isn't true, because no editor in the country is going to publish it, and because the people who are involved in it have already demonstrated a willingness to make problems disappear that goes significantly beyond filing an injunction or pulling advertising. But I'm writing it down anyway, because that's what I do. And because if something happens to me in the next 72 hours, I want there to be a record somewhere that says what I found and who I think is responsible and why I think they did it. It started with a tip. Everything starts with a tip. Mine came from a woman named Sandra Vela, who had been a contract logistics coordinator for the Department of Defense for 9 years before she was let go in what the official paperwork described as a restructuring. Sandra didn't see it that way. Sandra saw it as what happens when you start asking questions about cargo manifests that don't match the physical shipments they're supposed to describe, and when your questions get escalated up the chain to someone who doesn't answer them but does initiate a performance review 2 weeks later that results in your termination 6 weeks after that. Sandra found me through a mutual contact, a former ATF agent named Dennis, who I'd worked with on a piece about weapons diversion 2 years earlier. Dennis told her I was someone who could be trusted with sensitive material and who knew how to protect a source, both of which are true. She contacted me through an encrypted messaging app, and we spent 3 weeks establishing trust before she would agree to meet in person, which is the correct amount of time for a source in her situation. We met at a diner in Tucson on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and she sat across from me with both hands around a coffee cup and told me what she had seen. Sandra had been coordinating logistics for a series of shipments that arrived at Fort Carver, which is a mid-sized Army installation approximately 40 miles from the Arizona-Mexico border over a period of about 18 months beginning in early 2021. Fort Carver is a real place. You can find it on a map. It has a public affairs office and a community relations program, and it hosts a family day every June where local kids can look at military equipment and eat hot dogs. It is to all external appearances a straightforward military installation, doing the ordinary work of a military installation in a border region, which involves some actual defense activity and a significant amount of logistics and supply chain management for operations throughout the Southwest. What Sandra told me was that beginning in early 2021, a series of shipments began arriving at Fort Carver that did not appear on the standard logistics manifest she maintained. They appeared on a separate system she was given access to through a secondary login she was told was for overflow documentation, classified at a level above her standard clearance, which she was instructed to treat as routine and not discuss. The shipments arrived at irregular intervals, always at night, always through the base's secondary freight entrance rather than the main logistics gate, and they were offloaded by a small team that Sandra did not recognize and that did not appear on any base personnel roster she could access. She told me the cargo was always the same. Large crates, heavy temperature controlled, based on the refrigeration units attached to their sides. The crates were not labeled with standard military cargo identifiers. They were labeled with a series of alphanumeric codes that Sandra had tried to run through the standard classification system and found no match for. She had photographed two of the labels on her personal phone before she was told that personal devices were prohibited in the secondary freight area, a policy that had not existed until approximately 3 weeks after she started asking about the manifest discrepancy. She showed me the photographs. The labels were real. The codes were real. I photographed the photographs on my own phone, and I have copies on 3 separate encrypted drives, and I will get to what I found when I ran those codes myself later in this document. Sandra told me one more thing before we parted ways that afternoon. She said that on one occasion, a night in November of 2022, she had been working late in the logistics office and had heard something from the direction of the secondary freight area. She described the sound as something she had never heard before and could not compare to any animal she was familiar with. She said it was low and rhythmic and that it had a quality to it that she could only describe as wrong, a sound that her body responded to before her brain could process it, a full-body physical reaction of the kind she associated with genuine fear rather than ordinary startle. She said the sound lasted approximately 4 minutes and then stopped, and that when she looked out the window toward the freight area, the lights had been turned off and there was no movement visible, and she had gone back to her work and told herself she had imagined it. She was let go 3 months later. I spent 2 weeks after meeting Sandra doing background research, not on Fort Carver specifically, on the broader landscape of what I knew about military logistics, irregularities along the southern border on the companies involved in DoD contract work in the region, on the specific type of secondary clearance system Sandra had described. I called 3 former military logistics people I had worked with over the years and asked general questions about documentation practices without specifying what I was looking at. 2 of them gave me standard answers. The third, a retired Army logistics officer named Frank Bellamy, who I had known for 4 years and who had helped me on 2 previous pieces. Went quiet for a moment when I described the secondary manifest system, and then said that sounded like a Trident designation and asked where I was seeing it. I told him I couldn't say yet. He said he understood. He said Trident was a designation he had encountered exactly once in his career on a shipment he had been instructed to process and not document in 2018, and that when he had asked his commanding officer what Trident meant, he had been told that it was a classification for materials requiring specialized handling, and that his job was to handle the logistics and not the classification. He said the shipment he had processed had arrived in the same manner Sandra described at night through a secondary entry with a team he didn't recognize. He said he had never seen another Trident designation and had assumed it was a one-time thing. He said he was glad he had assumed that because knowing it was a recurring thing was making him feel something he would prefer not to feel. I told him not to worry about it. He said that was easy for me to say. I said he was right, and I apologized, and he said, "Call me when it's done." And I said I would, and I ended the call and sat with what I had for a while. I had a source with direct experience of the shipments. I had a former military officer who had confirmed the existence of the classification system. I had 2 photographs of cargo labels that I needed to run down. I had a base 40 miles from the Mexican border and a pattern of nighttime deliveries that someone had gone to significant trouble to keep off the standard records. What I didn't have was anything that told me what was in the crates. Getting that was going to require getting closer to Fort Carver than a journalist has any legitimate reason to be. I want to explain something about how investigative journalism works in practice because I think people have a version of it in their heads that is different from the reality. The reality is that most of what we do is legal. It is uncomfortable and it is persistent, and it involves asking questions that powerful people do not want asked, but the actual gathering of information is, most of the time, done through legal channels. Public records requests, interview requests, document review, background research. The law provides journalists with significant access to public information, and the best investigative work is done by mining that access thoroughly, rather than by doing anything that would give a subject grounds to shift the story from what they did to what you did to find out about it. There are exceptions. I am not going to pretend that I have never crossed a line in 11 years of doing this work. I have. I have gone places I wasn't supposed to go and looked at things I wasn't authorized to look at, and I have made my peace with the ethics of it on a case-by-case basis, asking myself whether the public interest served by what I might find was proportionate to the risk and the legal exposure involved. I have always been able to answer yes to that question and live with the answer. I am asking myself that question now, sitting in this motel room, and the answer is still yes. But it's a different kind of yes than it has been before. It's the yes of a person who found something that changed their understanding of what is at stake. I drove to the town of Mirabel, Arizona, which is the closest civilian community to Fort Carver, in the first week of May. I rented a room at the only motel in town, a 12-unit place called the Desert Rest that smelled like old carpet and industrial disinfectant and had a parking lot that overlooked a stretch of scrubland that ran toward the base's outer perimeter about 2 miles to the south. I told the woman at the front desk I was researching military history in the region, which was true enough to say without discomfort. I spent the first 4 days doing exactly what a legitimate researcher would do. I visited the Mirabel Public Library and read through their local history collection. I drove the roads around the base perimeter and took photographs of the public-facing infrastructure, the main gate, the signage, the visible buildings. I ate at the one diner in town, which is where most of the base's civilian support staff ate lunch, and I listened to conversations without participating in them, which is a skill that takes time to develop, and which people who haven't developed it consistently underestimate the value of. I heard 3 things at that diner that I wrote down in the small notebook I keep in my left jacket pocket. The first was a reference by 2 women who worked in base administration to something they called the night crew, said in the tone of something that is a known quantity within a community and requires no explanation. One of them said the night crew had been running 3 shifts a week lately, and the other one said she knew because her husband worked the security rotation near the secondary freight area, and he'd been coming home wrong lately. I wrote down the phrase "coming home wrong" and drew a line under it. The second was a conversation between a man who identified himself as a retired Army MP and a younger man who appeared to be active duty and who I later identified by his uniform insignia as assigned to the base's logistics division. The retired MP asked the younger man how things were going at the secondary freight area, a question that produced a silence long enough that I looked up from my food to check whether the younger man had heard it. He had heard it. He was looking at the table between them with an expression I recognized as the expression of someone deciding how much to say. He said it was fine. The retired MP nodded slowly in the way of someone who does not believe fine and is choosing to accept it anyway. The third thing was not a conversation. It was something I noticed on the way out of the diner, a bulletin board near the door where the town posted community notices and lost pet flyers and local business cards. Among these there was a handwritten index card, neat block letters that said, "For anyone who has heard things near the south perimeter at night, you are not alone." There was no contact information. The card was not new. It had the slightly yellowed quality of something that had been on that board for a while without being taken down. I photographed the card and put my phone away and drove back to the motel. That evening, I ran the alphanumeric codes from Sandra's photographs through every database I had access to, which, as an investigative journalist with 11 years of contacts, includes some databases that are not technically public. I got partial matches on 2 of the codes. Not full matches. Partial. The kind that tell you a thing is in the system somewhere, but that the full record has been restricted at a level above what I could access through the channels available to me. The partial matches both pointed to the same parent designation, which was not Trident. Trident was apparently a sub-classification. The parent designation was an acronym I am going to write out in full here because I think it matters. Covenant. I ran Covenant through everything I had. I found 3 references in public-facing government documents, all of them in contexts that didn't explain what the designation meant, all of them in footnotes or appendices of budget documents. From the early 2000s, all of them in line items that had been redacted, except for the designation itself. The total dollar amount I could reconstruct from the unredacted portions of those 3 documents, triangulating from the numbers visible around the redactions, was somewhere in the range of $400 million over a 3-year period. $400 million is a significant amount of money to spend on something classified in a way that produces no public-facing explanation whatsoever. I called Frank Bellamy again. I told him about Covenant. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said he had heard the word once at a briefing he had attended in 2019 that he had not been invited to attend but had sat in on because of a scheduling confusion that nobody had caught in time. He said the briefing had been about international acquisition protocols and that Covenant had been used in the context of what the briefing officer called non-standard biological material. He said he had not asked what non-standard biological material meant, because the context of the briefing had made it clear that asking questions was not the purpose of the attendees' presence. He said he had thought about it since and had arrived at interpretations he found plausible, but did not want to say aloud on a phone call. I said I understood. I said I was going to try to get a look at the secondary freight area at Fort Carver. He said that was going to be extremely difficult given that Fort Carver had a robust perimeter security system, and that military installations of that type were not places you could access without proper credentials. I said I knew. He said he supposed he couldn't talk me out of it. I said no. He said all right. He said be careful, and he meant it in the specific way that people mean it when they think careful might not be sufficient. I want to describe how I got onto the base because I think the method matters, and because I want to be honest about what I did. I did not hack anything. I did not bribe anyone. What I did was spend 3 days watching the civilian contractor traffic through the base's secondary entrance, which is less heavily monitored than the main gate because the personnel using it are lower-level contractors who go in and out multiple times a day, and I identified a plausible cover identity. There is a landscaping company based in Mirabel that holds a contract for grounds maintenance on the base. I rented a truck similar to the ones they use. I purchased work clothes consistent with what their employees wore. I borrowed a magnetic logo decal from a contact who does this kind of thing for a living and who I paid in cash and who I am not going to name. On a Thursday morning in mid-May, I drove through the secondary entrance at 7:15 in the morning, behind 2 actual contractor vehicles, maintaining the appropriate following distance, and I was waved through by a gate guard who looked at my vehicle and saw a landscaping truck and moved on to the next one. I parked in the contractor lot, which is behind a maintenance building on the eastern side of the base, and I spent the morning walking the base with a notebook and a measuring tape, the tools of someone doing site assessment for grounds maintenance work, which is what I looked like I was doing if you weren't paying close attention. The secondary freight area was on the south side of the base. I reached it at around 11 in the morning by taking a route that kept me behind buildings for most of the approach. The way you learn to move when you've spent time in places where being seen in the wrong location at the wrong time is a problem. The area was fenced separately from the rest of the base. A secondary perimeter of chain link topped with razor wire with a gate secured by a keypad rather than a guard. There were 2 security cameras visible on the fence posts. There were no vehicles in the area at that time and no visible activity. What there was a smell. I noticed it about 30 feet from the fence. It is difficult to describe a smell accurately in language, which is something writers are always told, and something I have found consistently true when the smell in question is something you have no prior reference for. The closest I can come is this. Imagine the smell of a large animal enclosure at a zoo. The dense biological smell of something large and warm-blooded living in a confined space. Then add to that something chemical, not industrial, not cleaning product, something more like a natural secretion, a compound that the animal itself was producing. Then underneath both of those, something older, something that the top notes were sitting on top of rather than replacing. A base note that I don't have a comparison for and that I am going to describe only as very old and very organic, and not like anything that belongs in southern Arizona. I stood at 30 feet from the fence and breathed through my mouth and made notes. There were 4 large buildings inside the secondary perimeter, all of them windowless, all of them with heavy exterior ventilation systems running along their roof lines. The kind of ventilation you install when the interior of a building needs to maintain a significantly different atmospheric condition from the exterior. There were no labels on the buildings. The doors were all closed. There was no visible activity, but there was a sound. I almost missed it. The ventilation systems were running, and the base had its ordinary ambient noise of vehicles and machinery and distant voices, and I almost categorized what I was hearing as part of that ambient noise and moved on. What stopped me was the rhythm. The ambient noise of a military base is not rhythmic in any organic sense. It has patterns, but they are mechanical patterns, the patterns of engines and equipment. What I was hearing from the direction of the secondary freight buildings had a different rhythm. Slow and even and low below the frequency where you hear it clearly, and above the frequency where you only feel it, in the range where sound becomes physical, where you feel it in your sternum and your molars rather than processing it through your ears. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes, listening to it and making notes. And then I heard a door open somewhere inside the perimeter, and I moved away from the fence and back toward the maintenance building and my truck. And I sat in the truck for a while with my hands on the steering wheel. I drove out at noon, waved through the gate again, and went back to the motel. I want to tell you that I sat with what I had for a reasonable amount of time and weighed my options carefully and made a measured decision about the appropriate next step. That is not what happened. What happened is that I sat in the motel room for 3 hours getting progressively more convinced that I was not going to be able to walk away from this without knowing what was in those buildings, and that the decision I was making was the one I always made when a story reached a certain temperature, which was to get closer. I called a man named Ray Cortez, who I had worked with on the cartel piece 3 years earlier. Ray is not a journalist. Ray describes himself as a security consultant, and that description covers a range of activities. some of which are legal and some of which occupy a more complex relationship with legality, and which I have never asked about in specific detail, because specific detail is not always useful. What Ray is in practical terms is someone who knows how to move through places he hasn't been invited to move through, and who knows people who know how to do the same thing, and who has never gotten any of his people killed on a job, which is the primary qualification I care about when I'm asking for help with something that has a physical risk component. I told Ray what I had. He listened without interrupting, which he always does, and then he said that sounded like something that was going to require more than the two of us. I said I knew. He said he could put together 4 people, maybe 5, all of them former military, all of them experienced with installations of that type. I said, what would that cost? He named a number. I said I didn't have that. He named a lower number. I said I could work with that if I could get a publisher to front it as operational expenses, which was not a conversation I was looking forward to having, but which I had had before. I called my editor at the digital publication that currently runs most of my work, a woman named Andrea, who has a higher tolerance for unconventional methodology than most editors I've worked with, because she came up through the same kind of investigative background and understands that the story you get by following every rule is sometimes not the story that needs to be told. I gave her the outline. Not everything. Enough. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that if I was going back onto that base, I needed to bring something out that she could publish, because without publishable material, she couldn't justify the expense or the liability. I said I understood. She said she hoped I did because the liability in this situation was not abstract. I said I understood that too. She approved the expenses. Ray and his people were in Mirabel by the following Wednesday. There were 5 of them, plus Ray, all men in their 30s and 40s, all carrying themselves with the specific economy of movement that military training produces, and that doesn't fully go away regardless of how long you've been out. Ray introduced them by first names only. I didn't ask for more. We met in the motel parking lot at 9 in the evening, and I walked them through what I knew and what I had seen and what I thought we were looking at. The plan was straightforward in the way that plans are straightforward before they encounter the thing they didn't account for. We would go in the same way I had gone in during the day through the secondary contractor entrance at 2 in the morning when the gate traffic was minimal and the guard rotation was at its lowest alertness point. Ray's people would handle the perimeter fence of the secondary freight area. I would go in with 2 of them, document what was in the buildings, and we would be out before the 4 a.m. rotation change. We drove onto the base at 2:17 in the morning in 2 vehicles, a truck like the one I had used before, and a plain white van that Ray said was the kind of vehicle that reads as utility maintenance, regardless of the time of day. The gate guard at 2 in the morning is a different proposition from the gate guard at 7:15. He looked at both vehicles for longer than his counterpart had during the day shift. He checked IDs. Ray's man in the lead truck had a contractor ID that I am not going to describe in detail except to say that it was good enough to pass a visual check in low light by a guard at the end of a long shift. We were waved through. We parked in the contractor lot and marched on foot across the base toward the secondary freight area. The base at 2 in the morning is quiet in a way that daytime visits don't prepare you for. The ordinary ambient noise is gone, and what remains is the sound of the perimeter lighting systems and the distant generators and the very particular silence of a large institutional space where most of the people in it are asleep. We moved between buildings, and Ray's people moved the way people move when they know what they're doing, and I moved behind them the way a journalist moves when he is somewhere he has no business being and is trying to occupy as little space as possible. The secondary freight area fence took Ray's man 8 minutes to defeat, which involved a device I didn't ask about, and a section of fence that was subsequently restored to its original appearance well enough to pass a casual inspection. We went through in pairs and assembled inside the perimeter in the shadow of the largest building. The smell was worse than it had been during the day, significantly worse. Ray's man on my left, a compact former ranger named Soto, who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan, and who I had the impression did not rattle easily, took a breath through his nose and then switched to breathing through his mouth without commenting on why. The other man on my left was Ray himself, who had similarly made the switch without announcement. I had already been breathing through my mouth since we crossed the fence. The sound was there, too. The low rhythmic thing I had heard during the day, but different at this hour, slower. The rhythm changed, longer spaces between the pulses. Ray tilted his head toward it and then looked at me, and I shook my head, meaning I didn't know what it was, and he nodded, meaning he believed me, and we moved toward the nearest building. The door was secured with the same type of keypad as the perimeter gate. Ray's man on electronics, a quiet person who had been introduced as Webb and who carried a bag of equipment I hadn't examined, worked the keypad for 4 minutes and got us through. We went in. I have been in a lot of difficult places in 11 years of doing this work. I have been in meth houses and cartel stash houses and illegal slaughterhouses and a room in a warehouse in El Paso that I think about sometimes in the middle of the night and try not to think about the rest of the time. I have seen things that I could not put in print because no editor would run them, and because some things are not served by being described in detail. I say this not to establish credentials, but to give you a frame of reference for when I tell you that what was in that building is in a category by itself. The interior of the building was divided into large individual spaces by concrete walls. Not partitions, actual concrete construction, the kind you build when you need structural separation, rather than just organizational separation. The spaces were accessed through heavy metal doors with reinforced frames and viewing windows of thick glass. The kind of glass you see in facilities designed to contain things that press against surfaces with sustained force. Each door had a control panel beside it with a digital display showing temperature, atmospheric readings, and what appeared to be weight measurements that I did not understand the purpose of until later. Webb swept the room with the device that told him there were no active surveillance feeds, which he attributed to the time of day, and what he said was a scheduled maintenance window that someone in the base's IT infrastructure had failed to close properly, a gap he had identified through the same research that had produced the gate credentials. I didn't ask how he had found it. I photographed everything. The first two spaces we opened were empty. Not empty like rooms that have been recently vacated. Empty like rooms that had been recently cleaned the floors, showing the particular scrubbed quality of surfaces that have been thoroughly sanitized. The drains in the center of each floor still damp. The walls bare, but for the marks that something had made against them over time. Marks that I photographed in detail, and that I will describe as the marks of something large applying pressure to a surface repeatedly, and from multiple angles, the kind of marks that accumulate when a large animal moves continuously in a confined space. The third space was not empty. I am going to describe what we found in the third space, and I am going to describe it as accurately as I can, and I am going to ask you to extend me the same good faith I have tried to extend throughout this document, which is the good faith of assuming that a person who has spent 11 years reporting facts is not suddenly making things up. The space was large, maybe 30 feet by 40, with a ceiling height of about 15 feet. The floor had the same drains and the same scrubbed quality as the others, but the walls had a different quality, darker, with a layered texture that resolved at close range as a biological material, something secreted against the surfaces over a long period. Accumulated in layers the way a substance accumulates when an organism deposits it repeatedly in the same location. The smell in this space was what the smell outside the building had been, a diluted version of concentrated and layered and deeply wrong in the way that some smells are wrong before your brain catches up to explaining why. In the far corner of the space, occupying an area of roughly 10 by 10 feet, was a mass of what I initially processed as machinery, something mechanical and tangled, complex and dark. It was not machinery. I understood this as soon as my flashlight reached it fully, and I was able to resolve the details. It was a living thing. Or it had been living. I am not certain of its current status, and in the time we had, I could not determine it. What I can tell you is what it looked like. It was large, which I have already said, but large in a way that the word large doesn't adequately cover. It occupied its corner from floor to ceiling and from wall to wall, not because it was pressed into the corner, but because it filled the space it occupied in the way that a large animal fills a small enclosure, with a natural density that makes the enclosure seem to have been built around it, rather than built first. Its surface was not consistent, not one texture, not one color. It was layered in a way that suggested a complex structure beneath the surface, something organized internally in a way that was not random, not accidental. There were sections of it that moved, slowly, with the rhythm I had been hearing from outside, the low pulse of something maintaining a biological process in a state of minimal activity. There were no features I could identify as a face. There were no features I could identify as limbs in any configuration I recognized. What there was in multiple locations across the surface of the thing were structures that I am going to call openings, because I don't have a better word, apertures of varying sizes that opened and closed with the rhythm, that were lined with something that caught the flashlight differently from the surrounding surface, something with a different refractive quality, something wet and dark. Soto made a sound behind me, not a word. The sound a person makes when their body processes something before their brain does. Ray put his hand on my shoulder and said quietly that we should document and move. I agreed. I photographed everything. I took video. I moved around the perimeter of the space, keeping a distance of approximately 15 feet from the thing in the corner, and I documented every angle I could access in the time we had. We were in the third space for approximately 8 minutes. I have watched the video since, and it is 8 minutes and 40 seconds. It felt significantly shorter, which is consistent with what stress does to time perception, and I note this because I want to be honest about the limits of my own reliability as a witness. We moved to the fourth space. The fourth space was different from the others. It was smaller, and it was equipped not with the containment infrastructure of the other spaces, but with what was clearly a working area. There were tables with equipment on them, scientific-looking equipment, the kind of setup I associated with biological sample processing. There were storage units along one wall, refrigerated, with the kind of door seals that maintain specific atmospheric conditions. There were filing cabinets, actual physical filing cabinets, metal old enough that their presence in a modern facility seemed deliberate rather than vestigial. Ray's man checked the room for active surveillance and said it was clean. I went to the filing cabinets. I am going to summarize what was in those cabinets because the full content is extensive, and because the most important elements can be conveyed without reproducing everything. What I found was documentation, substantial documentation covering a period from 2018 to the present, of a program designated Covenant that was operating under the joint administration of the Department of Defense, and a private entity whose name appeared on the documents as Meridian Biological Partners, which I had not heard of before, and which I subsequently discovered is a Delaware-registered corporation, with no public-facing operations, no website, no visible staff, and a registered agent address that is a law firm in Wilmington that handles incorporation for entities that want to exist on paper without existing in practice. The documentation described a program that had been acquiring biological specimens from international sources, primarily from regions of Southeast Asia and South America specimens that were classified in the documents as Type 4 non-standard biological material, which was the same phrase Frank Bellamy had heard at his briefing. The documentation included what appeared to be transportation logistics for multiple acquisitions over the 4-year period, each acquisition described in the technical language of wildlife trafficking, except for the specific classification of the material being trafficked, which was never described in plain language, but which across the full body of documentation. I was able to piece together enough context to understand. The program was not acquiring animals, not in any classification of animal that the existing scientific framework accounts for. The documentation referenced species designations that did not correspond to any taxonomy I could match against existing records. It referenced acquisition locations that were described as remote and access restricted in ways that suggested the remoteness was a factor in why the specimens had not previously been documented. It referenced handling protocols that included precautions specific to the biological properties of the specimens, precautions that covered things like atmospheric sensitivity, response to light stimulus, and something described as resonance, output which I understood to mean the sound, the low rhythmic pulse that I had heard from outside the building, and that I now understood was not a building sound, but was the sound of the thing in the third space. Most importantly, the documentation included financial records. Transaction records in the kind of detail that a competent forensic accountant could reconstruct a complete financial picture from, covering payments between the Department of Defense and Meridian Biological Partners in one direction, and payments between Meridian Biological Partners and a set of international acquisition contractors in the other direction. The total value of the transactions in the 4-year period covered by the documents was, as far as I could calculate on the basis of what I was reading in a filing cabinet in a restricted military facility at 2:30 in the morning, in the range of $800 million. $800 million for things that could not be classified under any existing biological framework. I took photographs of every document I could reach in the time we had. I filled 2 SD cards. I put the SD cards in separate pockets, and I zipped both pockets, and I told Ray we needed to go. What happened next was not part of the plan, which is the definition of what goes wrong on operations like this. As we were moving out of the fourth space back toward the building's main entrance, Webb, who had stayed near the door as a watch, held up his hand in the gesture that means, "Stop moving." We stopped. He pointed at the ceiling, and I looked and saw that the ventilation system, which had been running at a consistent rate since we entered, had changed. The rate had increased significantly. In the context of what we knew about the purpose of that ventilation system, increasing its rate meant something about the atmospheric conditions in the building had changed. I looked at Soto. He was looking at the door to the third space. The door to the third space was open. We had closed it when we left. I had watched Ray close it, and I had heard the latch engage. The door was now open, not wide, not all the way, but open with a gap of approximately 2 feet between the door and the frame. The sound had changed too. The rhythm was faster. The slow, deep pulse had accelerated to something more urgent, more present. No longer something you felt in your sternum, but something you heard clearly, and it was coming from the direction of the open door rather than from behind a closed one. Ray said, "Go." He said it quietly and without any drama, and we went. We moved fast through the main room of the building toward the exterior door, Webb leading Ray behind me, Soto behind Ray. The exterior door required Webb to work the keypad on the way out, the same way he had worked it on the way in, and those 30 seconds standing at the door while Webb worked the panel and the sound from the direction of the third space continued to change in a direction I did not like were the longest 30 seconds I have spent in recent memory. The door opened. We went out. Ray's other 3 people were waiting at the perimeter fence where we had entered. We had arranged a signal for urgency, and Soto gave it, and they had the fence open before we reached it, and we went through and across the base toward the vehicles at a pace that was technically not running, but was as fast as not running can be. We were in the vehicles and moving toward the gate at 3:04 in the morning. The gate guard at that time was a different man from the one who had let us in. He stopped us longer. He checked IDs with more attention. He looked at the vehicles with the flashlight. Ray's lead man was very good under pressure, and I watched him from the back seat of the van conduct himself with exactly the right combination of mild inconvenience at the delay and complete confidence in his right to be there. And after approximately 90 seconds, the guard waved us through. We drove south and did not stop for 40 minutes. And then Ray pulled off the highway onto a county road and stopped. And we all got out and stood in the desert in the dark for a minute without saying anything. Then Soto said, "What was that?" He said it to me directly, the way people ask questions when they've decided you're the one with the information. I said I wasn't entirely sure. He said, "What are you partially sure of?" I said I was partially sure that whatever the program I'd found documentation for was doing, it had been doing it for at least 4 years, that it involved the acquisition and transportation of biological specimens that didn't fit any existing classification that the U.S. government was paying a private company nearly $1 billion to manage it, and that at least some of what they had acquired was currently in those buildings, Ray said, and the thing in the third space. I said, yes, the thing in the third space. He said he'd seen things in his time he hadn't been able to explain. I said I believe that. He said that was in a different category. I said yes. He said, was it dangerous? I said I didn't know. He said it had gotten out of a locked space. I said, I know. He said that was worth knowing. I said yes. We drove to the motel and I collected my equipment and my notes, and I was on the road within 40 minutes of getting back. Ray had advised strongly against staying in Mirabel, and I agreed with him. I have been moving since. I am on my 4th location in 8 days. The 2 SD cards are in locations I am not going to specify. Copies of their contents are in additional locations. I am also not going to specify. I have sent a portion of the financial documentation and 3 of the photographs to Andrea, who has said she is consulting with the publication's legal team and is not yet in a position to commit to publication. Which I understand, and which is why I am writing this in a form that can be distributed outside of her control. I have tried to reach Sandra Vela. Her encrypted messaging app account no longer exists. I have tried to reach Frank Bellamy. His phone goes to voicemail. I have driven past his house in Tucson, which I know the location of, and the house appeared unoccupied in a way that felt recent rather than long-term. I have not been home. My apartment in Phoenix is presumably being watched by someone, and I am not going back to it until I understand better what the watched by someone situation involves. I want to tell you what I think is happening because I think the explanation, while not complete, is coherent enough to be useful. I think the Covenant program began as exactly what it is documented as being an acquisition program, a procurement operation for biological material of an unusual type. I think that at some point in the history of that program, the people running it understood that what they were acquiring was not simply rare or unusual, but was something that existing scientific and legal frameworks had no category for, and that the absence of a category meant the absence of oversight, and that the absence of oversight was an opportunity. I think the private entity, Meridian Biological Partners, understood this opportunity better than the government partners did, and structured the financial relationship accordingly. I think that the buyers of what Covenant acquires are not the U.S. government. I think the U.S. government is the logistics infrastructure and the security umbrella, and Meridian is the market. And the buyers are entities that have very specific reasons to want access to biological material that cannot be discussed publicly, cannot be regulated, and cannot be traced. I don't know what those reasons are. I have a few hypotheses. I am not going to share them here because hypotheses without evidence are not my business. What I can tell you is what I know. There is a program operating on a U.S. military installation in Arizona that is trafficking biological specimens of an unclassified and apparently unclassifiable nature. The program involves at least $800 million in transactions over 4 years. The specimens are being held in purpose-built containment facilities on the base. At least one of those specimens was, as of last Wednesday, at approximately 2:30 in the morning, alive and contained, and had demonstrated an ability to open a secure door from the inside. I have documentation. I have photographs. I have video. I am currently in a motel room with 52% battery on my laptop and a view of a parking lot and a highway that I have been watching for unfamiliar vehicles for the past 3 hours and have not seen any, which is either reassuring or means I'm not as good at this as I think I am. I am going to upload this document when I'm done. I am going to send the SD card contents to 3 additional recipients who are not Andrea and who do not know each other. I am going to move again tonight. If you're reading this and you want to verify any of it, start with the Delaware Corporate Registry and Meridian Biological Partners. Start with the budget line items in the 2014 and 2016 defense appropriations that have covenant redactions. Start with Fort Carver's secondary freight area and the ventilation infrastructure of the 4 buildings in the southern perimeter. Start with the community bulletin board at the Mirabelle Diner and the index card that has been up there long enough to yellow. Start somewhere, that's all I'm asking. Start somewhere and follow it. I've spent 11 years following things, and I've never found anything I wished I hadn't found. Until now, I mean that in a straightforward way, the way a journalist means it when the story is hard, but the story is the story. Now I mean it differently. Now I mean it in the way of a person who has seen something that reorganized the categories and is sitting in a motel room trying to decide how much of the reorganization to put in writing, because putting it in writing makes it real in a way that real things have consequences. The thing in the 3rd space was real. The documents are real. The program is real. I'm real for the moment. I intend to stay that way. Cal Reeves, investigative journalist, 11 years. This is my work. This document was posted to 3 separate platforms on May 28th of this year under the username CR Investigates. It was removed from 2 of those platforms within 6 hours of posting. The 3rd platform, a document-sharing service based outside the United States, still hosts it as of the date of this writing. The author has not posted since. Andrea Marsh, editor at the digital publication referenced in the document, declined to comment when contacted. Frank Bellamy's phone number is now disconnected. A search of Delaware Corporate Registry records for Meridian Biological Partners returns no results. Fort Carver's Public Affairs Office did not respond to requests for comment. The index card on the Mirabelle Diner Community Bulletin Board was removed at an unknown date between May and June of this year. The space where it was posted is now empty. The document is still up, for now.